Fun is where you find it.
We're going to have one swing at time at Glen Echo, the amusement park in Washington.
Glen Echo Amusement Park.
This park is segregated. You're not trespassing. May I ask your race?
My race, I belong to the human race.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann. My co-host, Joey Angelfield, has an excused absence. Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. American Jews played a central role in interracial civil rights activism during the 1960s. A new documentary chronicles how an organized white, predominantly Jewish community joined a black student protest at an amusement park outside of Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to chat with Ilana Trachtman, an Emmy Award-winning documentary director and producer whose latest film is Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round. Ilana, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thanks. I appreciate your having me.
What attracted you to Glen Echo Amusement Park as a subject for your documentary?
I grew up actually about 20 minutes from the national park that is on the site of Glen Echo Amusement Park. And when I was a kid, it was like a urban decay. I mean, it was clear that it had been an amusement park. The carousel was still operating. There was all the Art Deco fonts everywhere and neon and, a kind of really particular color palette. And, it was impossible to walk around there and not have this sense of history and fun and, a bygone day. And there were always photographs around the park, inside and outside, of people like enjoying themselves in like hoop dresses, and black and white pictures of sailors throwing their girlfriends up in the air. It was just this idyllic kind of iconic example of a certain kind of Americana. And I always loved it. The park had all kinds of arts activities that were there, and everyone in my family did something else, and so we were there often. The DC Folk Festival was there, and we were there for that every year. I went to summer camp, day camp there. And it was only about more than 20 years after I moved away that I was back with my then fiancé, now husband, because I wanted to consider the park as a place to get married. And we ran into what's probably the only Orthodox Jewish park ranger at the National Park Service, and actually he's retired now, so now there's none. It's my guess. I would like to be proven wrong. Named Sam Swirsky, and Sam ended up telling us the story of the park's integration. And I was so shocked that my Glen Echo Park was like harboring this dirty secret, and that I hadn't known that this kind of cruelty was right there. And it was kind of, it was relatively recent at that point. And, just being in touch with this paradox that this place that was so beloved for white Washingtonians was actually like a site of exclusion and rejection and cruelty for people of color. And that really shamed me and motivated me to find out more. And as I was learning about who the Jews were that took part in that protest, I was just reminded of my dad, who had passed recently, and he was a Jewish labor organizer. And so the kinds of things that I was reading, the newsletters, the quotes, were so familiar. I felt like these are people who could have been at my dinner table. So that's where it started. That's how I got addicted, and I felt like I was kind of continuing a conversation with my father.
Yeah, I think it's a fairly common experience to be tricked by those old photographs, right? That we see something very joyful and very iconic and idyllic and sort of this quintessential America that maybe never was, because we don't really see what's beneath the surface of those kinds of photos.
I mean, I think that's true because we're white. I am sure that an African American person looks at that photograph and knows exactly what they're seeing. So, yeah. And I mean, and frankly, I think we really need to train ourselves to look at everything differently. Um, you know, I've actually never talked about this before, but this film took a long time. It took 10 years, and so it was really, like, in the air in my house for a long time. And, I took my kids to our local children's museum when they were, like, 5 and 7, and they have a carousel in the museum that's actually by the same maker as the carousel at Glen Echo. And they had pictures, of kids on the carousel, the 20s, 30s, 40s. And they looked at the pictures and they said, "Look, mom, this carousel was integrated." And I was just I was just struck by the fact that, like, that was that they knew to look for that, and they recognized it, and they recognized that it was unusual.
Glen Echo became a focal point of the civil rights movement when students from Howard University were arrested for sitting on a segregated carousel in 1960. Why was this such an important moment?
I don't think it was an important moment for that many people. I mean, I think that in the context of what was going on in the spring and summer of 1960, it was, like, relatively, but probably relatively uninteresting. February 1st of 1960 was the Greensboro sit-ins, and that's when you had, 4 African American students from A&T College who sat down at a white lunch counter. And that event was significant because it set off ripples of other similar kinds of sit-ins at lunch counters that were started by students at HBC, historically Black colleges and universities across the country. And so Howard University students also picked up that momentum, and they were looking for a place that they could turn their energy. At the time, DC, where Howard University is located, was integrated. De facto, it was segregated, but legally, it was integrated. However, Maryland and Virginia, which were really close by, were not. And they started their work at lunch counters in Arlington. But then when they came to Maryland, what was really unusual, and unusual compared to all the other sit-ins that were taking place across the country, is they were immediately joined by a large white community. Like, this demonstration of what the word that we now call is allyship, that word didn't exist, and the concept didn't really exist. And it's a perfect storm, really, of the moment in time, the fact that it's outside of Washington, D.C., the fact of this really liberal, progressive community that is quite quite literally across the street from Glen Echo Amusement Park, and the fact that this community had already been agitating uh, against the park and had been boycotting the park kind of unofficially since they were there in 1946.
Could you tell us a little more about the predominantly Jewish neighboring community of Bannockburn?
So Bannockburn was built in 1946, and it was formerly a golf course that was bought by a cooperative. And the cooperative was largely Jewish, made up of people who often were people who worked for labor unions, people who worked for the federal government, some academics who, when they moved to Washington, D.C., because many of them were from other places, were shocked to find out that there were housing covenants in place that restricted entire neighborhoods from selling homes to Jews. And not being able to live in the places they wanted to live, they bought this collective uh, property, this golf course, and turned it into, in some ways, like a utopian vision of a neighborhood. And by the time the houses were built and Bannockburn was settled, it certainly wasn't all Jewish by any means, but it retained Jewish character. It had the reputation for being actually with some. I've heard people refer to it as Jewtown, um, and it was a really liberal place. and civil rights and civil and human rights, I'd say, was dear to the people of Bannockburn's hearts. Um, they were living across the street from Glen Echo Amusement Park, which offended them to their very core. The fact that people couldn't get in if they were of color, and most of the people in the neighborhood boycotted Glen Echo, and would say, "We're not going to the amusement park until our," what they said, "Negro friends can go." So they were kind of the perfect partners for the Howard University students. They just nobody knew it yet.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Glen Echo was also owned by two Jewish brothers who were apathetic about the park being segregated. Did that fact further motivate Jewish protesters, especially with the recent events of Nazi Germany looming in the background?
I don't know if I would say the park owners were apathetic. I think they actually were very happy to support segregation, because they felt that segregation um, s- furthered their income, and that keeping the park whites only was going to attract people who wanted to go to a place that was whites only. But I actually can't even um, I can't purport to read their minds because they said very little. Most of what they said was no comment. They did say at some point that they were keeping the park, that they weren't racist, but they were keeping the park for white for economic reasons. But I really don't know what was true in their hearts. Um, whether I, I don't know. I don't know how many people on the picket line actually knew that the owners of the park were Jewish. It's not like it was really public. Their name was Baker. Um, I think that the people who did know were ashamed and outraged. Um, I think there were people who felt like it was a personal, Jewish people who felt like they personally needed to not just condemn, but, uh, put their energy towards bringing this down. I think it was embarrassing, and I think that, um, the fact that it was just 15 years after the war and people are segregating was anathema, that other Jews were segregating, and when the American Nazi Party showed up in order to counter protest the picketers, they weren't just protesting people who wanted to integrate the park. They were supporting people who were segregating the park who were Jewish. And that's an incredible irony. Um, and also, I think speaks to uh, a real determination and fearlessness across the street among the protesters because there were protesters who were concentration camp survivors.
I would be picketing while there are these people here whom I fled.
One of the, I guess, lighter moments in the film, if I can say that, is when it's revealed that the park would sometimes allow dignitaries of color from other countries to come to the park, and Howard students would try to pretend to be dignitaries from Africa. And I don't know if it worked, but it was a very funny attempt to infiltrate the park.
Yeah, it was a very strange thing and also just shows you how random racism really is. At that moment, there was kind of a race between Russia and the United States to befriend Africa. And the way that we in America were treating Black people was embarrassing and did not make us friends among African politicians. And so the Eisenhower administration made a deal with the Baker brothers so that when there were visiting African dignitaries, they could use the park. So if people were of color, essentially, and from other countries, they could use the park. If they were African American, they could not use the park. And so Dion and Hank, two of the protagonists of the film, were trying to like expose that idiocy and pulled a prank of dressing up as African diplomats.
Several interviewees remarked that picketing side by side was the first meaningful Black-Jewish interactions they had. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it's very hard for us in 2025 to consider a time when segregation was so strict, that the walls were so high between races that it was perfectly normal for people of different races never to have any meaningful interaction their entire lives. Um, and we certainly live in segregated times now, but it's not nearly the same kind of segregation. And so, you had educated professional people who didn't interact with each other. And in that way, picketing was a watershed. And actually, one person says in the film, who was in college at the time, she's Jewish, and she's talking about meeting African American Howard students, and she says, they talked the same way I did, they had the same kind of education I did, and I was like looking in the mirror. And then she goes on to say, of course, I was really naive. I didn't understand what they had been through. But I think there was a real sense of recognition of the other, and that was really powerful. And, there are friendships that last to this day.
The park was desegregated on March 14th, 1961. Many of the picketers continued to be involved in civil rights activism. Do you see the Glen Echo protest as an incubator for the Black-Jewish Alliance?
I really resist categorizing Glen Echo and anyone in Glen Echo as representing anything other than themselves. And so I can say it was an incubator for Hank and Dion and Helene and Marty's Black Jewish Alliance. I cannot say it was an incubator for a Black Jewish Alliance writ large by any means. And I think that's really important. And just the fact that you had Jews who were supporting Howard University students, you also had Jews who were owning the segregated park. I think just that paradox right there proves that you can't cast everybody with the same brush. So there were Black Jewish alliances that existed for, certainly since the founding of the NAACP, but I'm sure before that as well. Um, I think it was life-changing for the individuals who are on the picket line, but I don't think that it speaks for anything beyond that.
Your film has obvious relevance in today's America. What lessons might viewers take away from this story?
There's a few lessons that I hope people take from this story, but I don't really want to prescribe lessons. And I didn't make the film um, in order to do any kind of moral instruction. I hope, first of all, that the film contributes to correcting a misunderstanding. And that misunderstanding, at least that I had, and I think the vast majority of people who grow up, educated in our schools and American schools have, is that the civil rights movement was like this handful of people, and they were all really important and really famous and really brave. And most people can name five, maybe at the most. John Lewis, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and that's pretty much like where it ends. And I don't think that people understand that most people who participated in the civil rights movement did not go to the bridge at Selma. They weren't part of the Montgomery bus boycott. They were just acting locally, and they were standing up at their local library or movie theater or lunch counter or restaurant or amusement park or swimming pool. And one doesn't have to make huge gestures that require intercontinental travel to make a difference. If we don't understand that regular people are in fact the foot soldiers, the fuel of social change movements, then we give ourselves a pass not to participate. And so I really hope that it fuels an understanding that we all have a part to play. We have a responsibility, but we also have a capacity. And I think that's kind of missing.
Yeah, as you mentioned that, it's true on the Jewish side as well that we look at certain iconic figures like Abraham Joshua Heschel, people like that, not realizing that most of these Jewish participants were not in any way motivated by scriptural or Talmudic teachings or anything like that, but really by the experiences of their family, the Holocaust, things like this. And again, ordinary people, students, older people, everyone in between, participating because they felt a sense of moral obligation that didn't come from anything, beyond experience.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I like the way that you put that. And I think about that photograph of Heschel on the bridge with MLK, and it's iconic. Everybody sees it at Hebrew school at some point. But I think it's a perfect example about this problem, because if that's the only Jew that you see who participated in the civil rights movement, and you yourself are not an older man with a long beard, you don't see a place for yourself. I mean, Heschel of all people is not so accessible as a role model, right? And so I think we really need to see these like regular people, these regular college students who, after all, were also 18 and 19 years old, many of them.
What's the best way to watch Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round?
Yeah, it's kind of coming to the end of the festival circuit. It's opening in theaters in New York City on September 17th. We're still figuring out, it will be screening in LA, at the Lemley. And other cities are sort of like coming online. But in the meantime, there are lots of these like one-off screenings all over the place.
Well, thank you so much, Ilana, for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for asking good questions.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.